In the kingdom of Avalmont, a royal wedding day becomes the spark that ignites a scandal unlike any before. As nobles gather and the Duke of Edlor waits at the altar, Princess Eleanor's chamber stands empty, her wedding dress abandoned, her window open to the morning breeze. Only a letter remains. "I have chosen to love with a free heart rather than live as a spoil of war." What drives a princess to forsake duty for love? What secret passion could compel her to flee with a common horse trainer, risking everything? Her title, her legacy, her very future. But perhaps the most shocking twist in this tale is not the princess's flight, but her father's response. As King Richard reads his daughter's farewell letter, kneeling in the straw of the royal stables, tears fall from the eyes of a man who hasn't wept in 20 years. And what he does next will challenge the very foundations of a kingdom built on centuries of tradition. This is a story of forbidden love that dared to defy convention, of courage that chose truth over comfort, and of a king's journey from rigid tradition to profound wisdom. Join us for a tale that will break your heart and rebuild it anew, leaving you questioning what truly matters most in this world. If you're enjoying this medieval romance, make sure to follow our channel for more heart-stirring tales. Leave a like and comment where you're watching from. Your support helps us bring more unforgettable stories to life. The sun had barely begun to ascend over the towering stone walls of Avalmont Castle, casting long shadows across the meticulously arranged courtyard. Servants scurried like ants, laying fresh flower petals along the path that would soon carry Princess Eleanor to her fate. The air vibrated with anticipation, fragrant with the scent of lilies and roses specially imported from the southern provinces. For this momentous occasion, inside the grand chapel, nobility from every corner of the kingdom adjusted their elaborate garments, whispering behind jeweled hands about the alliance that would be sealed today. The marriage between Princess Eleanor of Avalmont and the Duke of Edlor had been arranged for over a decade, a strategic union that would strengthen the northern borders and bring prosperity to both realms. Yet, as the bells began their solemn toll announcing the hour of ceremony, an unsettling quiet descended upon the gathered assembly. The Duke of Edlor stood tall at the altar, his 45 years visible only in the distinguished silver streaks at his temples. He adjusted the ornate golden brooch that fastened his royal blue cape, the crest of his house glinting in the light that streamed through stained glass windows. His face betrayed no emotion, though his eyes darted occasionally toward the massive oak doors through which his bride would enter. "She is simply ensuring every detail is perfect," one lady-in-waiting assured another, though her voice trembled with uncertainty. King Richard of Avalmont, seated upon an elevated throne at the front of the chapel, furrowed his brow as the minutes stretched painfully onward. He leaned toward his trusted advisor, Lord Blackwell, who had served the crown for 3 decades. "She swore she would be here," the king muttered, his knuckles whitening as he gripped the armrests of his seat. "Eleanor has never broken her word to me." The Queen Mother, Lady Beatrice, elegantly dressed in silver and pearl, pressed her ornate fan against her lips to hide their trembling. Her eyes, so like her daughter's, scanned the restless crowd with growing alarm. "Perhaps her handmaidens are having trouble with the veil," she suggested, though her voice carried no conviction. Outside the chapel, through corridors of stone and tapestry, the royal guard captain approached the princess's chambers. He knocked. Once, twice, then a third time with growing force. "Your Highness," he called, exchanging worried glances with the chambermaid, who stood wringing her hands beside him. "The ceremony awaits." When no answer came, he reluctantly pushed open the heavy door to reveal a chamber bathed in morning light and utterly empty. The magnificent wedding dress, crafted by 12 seamstresses over 6 months, lay abandoned across a velvet chair. Its pearls caught the sunlight, twinkling like stars against the ivory silk. The princess's jewelry box lay open, several precious pieces missing, and the window, the large window that overlooked the eastern gardens, stood wide open. Curtains, dancing in the breeze. "Sound the alarm," the captain whispered, his face draining of color. "The princess is gone." Within moments, the castle erupted into controlled chaos. Guards raced through corridors, servants were questioned, and the king himself rose from his seat when the news reached him, silencing the murmurs with a single raised hand. "Find her," he commanded, his voice deadly calm. "Search every corner of the castle grounds." In the royal stables, the frantic search revealed another discovery. Nightshade, the princess's beloved black mare, was missing from her stall. The stablemaster, pale-faced and trembling, reported that more troubling still was the absence of another horse, a chestnut stallion belonging to Rowan, the head horse trainer. "The stall is empty, Your Majesty," a young stable boy reported, pointing to the fresh hoofprints leading away from the castle. But Nightshade returned not long ago, alone and exhausted, as if ridden hard and sent back. The king followed the boy's guidance to where Nightshade now stood, her midnight coat still damp with sweat, her sides heaving with exertion. Attached to her saddlebag was a carefully folded parchment sealed with blue ribbon. "The princess's, a favorite color, for my father," read the elegant script on the outside. With hands that few in the kingdom had ever seen tremble, King Richard broke the seal and unfolded the letter. There, in the dusty stable surrounded by the scent of hay and leather, he sank to one knee as he read the words that would forever alter his kingdom. "Forgive me, father," the letter began in Eleanor's precise handwriting, "but I could not bear to live the rest of my days as a prize to be handed over for political gain. I have chosen to follow my heart, to love freely and completely as mother once told me I should. Nightshade will return to you, but I cannot. I choose to be Eleanor, the woman, not Eleanor, the princess to be bartered. Forgive me, but I have chosen to love with a free heart rather than live as a spoil of war. Your daughter always, Eleanor of Avalmont." A single tear escaped the king's eye, splashing onto the parchment. In 20 years of rule, none had seen him weep. Not when he'd lost his wife, not when he'd faced betrayal from his closest allies. But now, kneeling in the straw, the mighty King Richard wept silently for the daughter who had fled rather than bend to his will. "Your Majesty," Lord Blackwell approached cautiously, "the Duke awaits news." "Tell him," the king began, then closed his eyes briefly. "Tell him the wedding is postponed." "And the princess?" The king rose slowly, folding the letter with careful precision. "Prepare the royal guard. We ride at noon." Miles away, as dawn broke across rolling meadows still shrouded in morning mist, two figures on horseback paused atop a hill. Princess Eleanor, her regal posture unmistakable even in the simple woolen dress and cloak she now wore, gazed forward toward the distant mountains. Her dark hair, usually elaborately styled with jewels and ribbons, hung in a simple braid down her back. At 38, her beauty remained striking, high cheekbones, intelligent eyes the color of stormy seas, and a determined set to her jaw that spoke of the royal blood flowing through her veins. Beside her rode Rowan, the royal horse trainer, his weathered hands steady on the reins of his chestnut stallion. At 40, his face told the story of a life lived outdoors. Tanned skin, with lines that deepened when he smiled, strong shoulders beneath a rough-spun shirt, and eyes that held both gentleness and unwavering resolve. He was handsome, in an earthy, impowerful way that contrasted sharply with the polished nobility Eleanor had known all her life. "Do you regret it?" he asked softly, his deep voice carrying on the morning air. Eleanor turned to face him, reaching across the space between their horses to grasp his calloused hand in her own. Her eyes, though rimmed with exhaustion, shone with certainty. "Not for a single heartbeat," she whispered. Behind them, the first glint of armor appeared on the horizon, the sun catching on the helmets of the royal guard as they began their pursuit. Eleanor's grip tightened on Rowan's hand, fear flickering across her face for the first time. "Don't look back," she said, her voice trembling slightly despite her resolve. Rowan's eyes, the warm brown of autumn leaves, met hers with a depth of emotion that made her breath catch. "As long as you're ahead of me, I never will," he replied, his voice thick with emotion. They urged their horses forward, disappearing into the forest that marked the border of the kingdom, two silhouettes merging into one as they rode toward an uncertain future, bound together by a love that had proven stronger than duty, stronger than royal decree, stronger even than the fear of what would surely come hunting them. Behind them, the castle bells continued to toll, no longer announcing a royal wedding, but instead marking the beginning of a pursuit that would shock the entire kingdom and reveal truths long buried beneath the weight of crown and obligation. The sun climbed higher, casting golden light across the kingdom of Avalmont, illuminating both the abandoned wedding finery in the princess's chamber and the determined figures of the royal guard riding hard across the countryside. In the stable, King Richard mounted his own steed, his face now a mask of regal determination as he tucked his daughter's letter inside his tunic, close to his heart. The day that should have sealed an alliance through an arranged marriage had, instead, birthed a scandal that would echo through the annals of history, and what the king would do when he found the fleeing couple would indeed shock the entire realm. 4 years earlier, on a crisp autumn afternoon, Princess Eleanor strode through the royal gardens with purposeful steps. At 34, she carried herself with the poised dignity expected of Avalmont royalty, though her eyes held a shadow that had lingered since the death of her husband, Lord Cedric, a year prior. Their marriage had been arranged when she was barely 16, a political alliance that had brought her title but little warmth. Eleanor paused as the distant sound of a horse's whinny caught her attention. Something in the animal's cry spoke of distress, drawing her toward the royal stables, despite the impropriety of a princess visiting such a place unaccompanied. As she approached, she heard a man's voice, low, gentle, speaking words of comfort she couldn't quite discern. The stable was dim after the bright sunlight, and Eleanor blinked as her eyes adjusted. There, in the last stall, knelt a man she didn't recognize. He was focused entirely on a chestnut mare with a badly splintered front leg, his strong hands moving with surprising delicacy as he adjusted the bandages. "You're brave, aren't you?" he murmured to the horse. "Surviving a battlefield like that. The others may call you broken, but I see your worth." Eleanor's silk slipper scraped against the stone floor, and the man turned sharply. His eyes, warm, brown like autumn leaves, widened in recognition as he immediately dropped to one knee. "Your Highness," he said, his voice deep and respectful, "forgive me, I didn't hear you approach." "Please rise," Eleanor replied, finding herself strangely affected by the genuine care she'd witnessed. "You're new to the royal stables?" "Rowan Mills, Your Highness. I arrived yesterday to serve as your father's horse trainer." He stood, and Eleanor noted his height, the breadth of his shoulders, the quiet confidence in his bearing despite his humble station. Unlike the preening courtiers who filled the castle halls, his strength seemed effortless, unassuming. "And this mare?" Eleanor approached the stall, careful of her fine blue gown. "Rescued from the northern skirmish, my lady. The military deemed her worthless with that injury, but I convinced your father's stable master to let me try to rehabilitate her." Eleanor studied the horse, then the man. "You think she can be saved when others would have her destroyed?" A flicker of something, determination perhaps, crossed Rowan's face. "I believe what others consider broken often holds the greatest potential for beauty, Your Highness." Their eyes met for a moment too long, and Eleanor felt an unexpected warmth rise to her cheeks. Without meaning to, she smiled, a genuine expression that had become rare since Lord Cedric's passing. "Then I shall look forward to seeing her progress, Master Mills." That first meeting blossomed into carefully orchestrated encounters over the changing seasons. Eleanor found reasons to visit the stables, inquiring about a suitable mount for a ceremonial procession, expressing concern about the quality of hay being provided for the royal horses. Each time, Rowan would appear, respectful but never servile, his eyes meeting hers with an understanding that required no words. By winter, their conversations had deepened. Eleanor would arrive bundled against the cold, ostensibly to check on her favorite mare, Nightshade. Rowan would have a brazier lit in the small tack room, and there, surrounded by the scent of leather and polish, they would speak of things beyond the castle walls, of distant lands he had seen in his travels, of books she treasured in the royal library. "Do you ever wish to be elsewhere, Your Highness?" he asked her one snowy afternoon as they watched flakes drift down through the stable window. Eleanor's gloved hands tightened around her goblet of mulled cider. "I am a princess of Avalmont. My place is here." "That wasn't my question," Rowan replied softly, daring to challenge her rehearsed response. Their eyes met, and for the first time in years, Eleanor allowed her royal mask to slip. "Every day," she whispered. "I wish for it every day." Spring brought longer days and more frequent meetings. They would ride together, always with a lady's maid following at a discreet distance to the hidden lake beyond the castle's eastern woods. There, surrounded by early wildflowers, Eleanor would read poetry aloud, while Rowan crafted intricate braids of grass and blossoms that he would ceremoniously present to her. "My mother taught me," he explained when she marveled at his dexterity. "She believed beauty should be created even in the hardest circumstances." "And what does your mother think of you, serving at the royal castle?" Eleanor asked, tucking one of his creations behind her ear. A shadow crossed Rowan's face. "She watches from the stars now, my lady. She passed when I was but 17. Eleanor, moved by the grief that still lingered in his voice, reached out impulsively and covered his hand with hers. "Then she would be proud of the man you've become." The summer of that first year brought whispers to the castle. Lord Blackwell began watching Eleanor more closely, noting her frequent absences from court functions. The king, distracted by border disputes, remained oblivious to his daughter's blossoming relationship with the horse trainer. It was during a fierce summer storm that everything changed. Thunder crashed overhead as Eleanor ran across the courtyard, her fine dress soaked through. Within moments, she burst into the stables, breathless and dripping, to find Rowan calming the nervous horses. "You shouldn't be here, Your Highness," he said, though his eyes betrayed his pleasure at seeing her. "If you're discovered—" "I don't care," she interrupted, pushing her wet hair from her face. "My father has just informed me that negotiations have begun again with Edlaw. The Duke has requested my hand, and father intends to agree." Rowan's face paled. "When?" "The betrothal will be announced at the Harvest Festival. The wedding would follow next spring." Her voice trembled, not from the cold, but from desperation. Lightning illuminated the stable, casting Rowan's features into sharp relief as he stepped closer. "Eleanor," he said, using her name for the first time, the sound of it intimate and perfect on his lips. "I cannot bear it," she whispered, propriety forgotten as she closed the distance between them. "I cannot be handed from one loveless arrangement to another, not now that I know—" "Know what?" he asked, though his eyes suggested he already understood. "What it feels like to be truly seen," she answered, reaching up to touch his face. "What It means to be valued not for my title, but for my heart. Rowan caught her hand, pressing it to his cheek. I have nothing to offer you but my heart. No lands, no title, no gold. I prefer mud and truth with you, Eleanor replied, her voice fierce despite its softness, than gold and lies with him. The storm raged outside as Rowan finally, after months of restraint, lowered his lips to hers. The kiss was gentle at first, then deepened with years of unspoken longing. When they parted, both breathless, Rowan's expression grew serious. I will find a way, he promised, his forehead pressed against hers. We will find a way. That night, beneath the sheltering darkness of the stable's hayloft, they made a pact sealed with whispered vows and intertwined fingers. For 4 years, they would build their escape plan with painstaking care, gathering resources, mapping routes, creating contingencies. And when the time came, they would flee together to forge a life where titles meant nothing and love meant everything. One day, Rowan had whispered, holding her hand as moonlight streamed through the stable window, someone will see the woman behind the crown, and they will love her until the end of their soul. His eyes, earnest and unwavering, had looked into hers with such certainty that Eleanor felt a peace she'd never known before. You already do, she'd replied, sealing their secret promise with another kiss. King Richard of Avalmont had never looked so small as he did in that moment, hunched over his daughter's letter in the privacy of his royal chambers. The morning light streamed through stained glass windows, casting kaleidoscope patterns across his ashen face. He had read the parchment 17 times now, each reading more painful than the last. His massive oak desk, usually piled high with proclamations and treaties, held only this single piece of parchment, Eleanor's farewell. Outside his door, the castle buzzed like an overturned beehive. The Duke of Edlor paced the corridor, his expensive boots wearing a path in the ancient stone floor. Lords and ladies whispered behind jeweled hands, their voices a constant drone of speculation and judgment. But the king had ordered solitude, and none dared disturb him. Your Majesty, Lord Blackwell's voice finally broke through as the afternoon shadows lengthened. The Duke demands an audience. The nobles require direction. The people are gathering in the square, waiting for news. Richard didn't answer immediately. His fingers traced the elegant script of his daughter's handwriting, lingering on the phrases that cut deepest. I choose to love with a free heart, rather than live as a spoil of war. Tell them, the king finally spoke, his voice hoarse from hours of silence, that I will address the court at sunset, not before. As the door closed behind his advisor, Richard rose from his desk with the weight of his 60 years pressing down upon his shoulders. He moved not toward his throne room, but in the opposite direction, toward the eastern wing of the castle, toward Eleanor's chambers. The room remained as she had left it, the abandoned wedding dress a pale ghost in the fading light. Richard ran weathered fingers over the silk, remembering suddenly how small Eleanor's hand had felt in his when she was a child. How had those years slipped away? How had he failed to see the woman his daughter had become? He lowered himself onto the edge of her bed, the same bed where he had sat reading her tales of brave knights and fair maidens when she was small. The memory came to him with startling clarity. Eleanor at 7 years old, her dark curls splayed across the pillow, her eyes wide with wonder. But father, she had asked, why must the princess always marry the prince she's told to marry? Because, little one, he had answered, tapping her nose affectionately, that is the duty of royalty. We marry not for ourselves, but for our kingdom. Even if she doesn't love him, love is a luxury for common folk, he had explained, with the certainty of one who had himself married for alliance rather than affection. For royalty, duty must always come first. You must be strong, resolute. There is no place for sentiment in ruling a kingdom. The king's throat tightened as another memory surfaced. Eleanor at 16, standing straight-backed as he informed her of her betrothal to Lord Cedric, a man 20 years her senior. He is a powerful ally, daughter. This union will secure our eastern border. She had not wept, had not protested. She had simply nodded, her eyes already growing distant, already learning to hide her heart. He had been proud of her composure then. Now the memory filled him with shame. I took away her choice, he whispered to the empty room. I never even asked what she wanted. A soft knock interrupted his thoughts. A servant entered with bowed head, carrying a tray of untouched food. Your Majesty hasn't eaten since morning, the servant murmured. Leave it, Richard commanded. But as the servant turned to go, he added, Wait, tell me, how long has Rowan Mills served in our stables? The servant looked surprised at the question. Nearly 4 years, sire. He came after the Northern Campaign, bringing wounded horses to rehabilitate. And how did he interact with the princess? The servant's eyes widened slightly before he carefully schooled his expression. It was not my place to observe such things, Your Majesty. It is your place to answer your king, Richard said, his voice low but firm. The servant swallowed hard. He was always most respectful, sire. But the princess did visit the stables. Often, to see her mare, she said. Richard nodded slowly, dismissing the man with a wave. As the door closed, he recalled with startling clarity a conversation that had occurred some 2 years past, a request from Rowan Mills that suddenly took on new significance in light of recent events. It had been a cool autumn morning, and Richard had been inspecting the new colts in the royal stable. Rowan had approached hat in hand and requested a private word. Your Majesty, he had said, his voice steady despite the obvious tension in his shoulders, I must request release from your service. Richard, surprised by the request from his most skilled trainer, had frowned. For what reason? Are you dissatisfied with your position? No, sire, Rowan had answered, his eyes carefully fixed on a point just beyond the king's shoulder. It is a personal matter. Something in the man's bearing had sparked the king's suspicion. Does this personal matter have anything to do with my daughter's frequent visits to these stables? Rowan's eyes had briefly met the king's, a flash of something fear, defiance, visible before being quickly masked. I assure you, Your Majesty, I have always shown Princess Eleanor the utmost respect due her station. Do you think I don't see how you look at her? Richard had asked, his voice dangerously soft. A man of your station should know better than to raise his eyes to a princess. Rowan's jaw had tightened, but he had remained silent. Your request is denied, the king had concluded. You will continue your duties here where I can keep an eye on you. But know this, if you ever step beyond the bounds of your position with my daughter, the consequences will be severe. Now sitting in Eleanor's abandoned chamber, Richard understood the true nature of that exchange. It had not been Rowan's feelings, and that were the threat, it had been his daughter's reciprocation of them. Rowan had been trying to leave to protect them both. And I kept him here, the king whispered, thinking I was preventing a danger when I was actually ensuring it. With sudden resolution, Richard stood and crossed to Eleanor's writing desk. He pulled out a fresh sheet of parchment and dipped a quill into ink. For several moments, he stared at the blank page, weighing decades of tradition against the expression in his daughter's eyes when she had handed him the marriage treaty with Edlaw just days before. I will do my duty, father, she had said, her voice as hollow as an empty suit of armor. Richard had mistaken her resignation for maturity. Now he recognized it for what it was: despair. The king began to write, his script bold and definitive. When he finished, he read over the words carefully, then folded the parchment and sealed it with the royal crest. Lord Blackwell, he called, opening the chamber door to find his advisor waiting in the corridor as expected. "Yes, Your Majesty." "Bring me the book of the law of noble birth," the king commanded, "and summon the royal chancellor. There is a decree that requires the official seal." Lord Blackwell's expression betrayed his confusion, but he bowed in acknowledgement. "And what of the search parties, sire? They await your command to pursue the princess and the stablemaster." Richard's face hardened into the expression that had made enemies tremble on battlefields. "Call them back. My daughter is not to be hunted like a criminal. But sire, the Duke of Edlore demands—" "The Duke," Richard interrupted coldly, "may demand nothing of Avalmont's king. Now go and bring me what I've requested." As his advisor hurried away, King Richard looked once more at Eleanor's abandoned wedding dress, at the chamber that had housed his daughter's quiet desperation for so many years. For the first time, he saw not the princess he had raised to fulfill political obligations, but the woman who had finally found the courage to claim her own life. The setting sun cast long shadows across the royal chamber as the king pressed his seal firmly into the melted wax, making official a decree that would send shockwaves throughout the entire kingdom. Dawn broke with tentative fingers of light over the abandoned mill that stood alone beside a rushing stream. 3 days had passed since Princess Eleanor and Rowan had fled the castle, their journey taking them through forest paths known only to hunters and woodsmen. The old stone mill, its wheel long since stilled by time, offered them sanctuary, remote enough to avoid detection, yet solid enough to provide shelter from the elements. Inside, Eleanor stirred beneath a rough woolen blanket, her eyes fluttering open to the unfamiliar sight of weathered wooden beams above her. For a moment, disorientation gripped her. Where were her silk sheets, her canopied bed, the ever-present handmaidens? Then reality returned in a rush of both fear and exhilaration as she felt Rowan's warm presence beside her. "You're awake," he said softly, already dressed and tending to a small fire in the hearth. The morning light caught in his tousled hair, giving him a golden halo that made Eleanor's heart quicken despite their precarious circumstances. "Have you slept at all?" she asked, noting the shadows beneath his eyes as she sat up, running fingers through her tangled hair. How strange it felt to wake without a dozen servants attending to her every need. How liberating. "I kept watch," Rowan replied simply, stirring a pot that hung over the flames. "We can't be too careful." Eleanor crossed the room to him, her borrowed dress, plain homespun wool rather than the fine silks she'd worn all her life, brushing against the rough-hewn floor. She placed a hand on his shoulder, feeling the solid strength that had given her courage to leave everything behind. "You need rest too," she chided gently. "We're partners in this escape, remember? Not princess and protector." Rowan turned to her, his expression softening as he reached up to tuck a strand of hair behind her ear. The casual intimacy of the gesture still surprised Eleanor. Such unguarded affection had never been part of her royal life. "Old habits," he murmured with a small smile. "I've spent 4 years watching over you from a respectful distance. It's difficult to break the habit of vigilance." "Then I shall help you practice," Eleanor replied, leaning forward to press her lips to his. Even now, after several stolen kisses during their journey, the contact sent sparks coursing through her veins. This was what the poets wrote about, what the minstrels sang of, this feeling of being both grounded and weightless at once. When they parted, Rowan's eyes remained closed for a moment, as if savoring the sensation. When they opened, they held a warmth that chased away the morning chill. "I've made porridge," he said, gesturing to the pot. "Nothing like the castle fare, I'm afraid." Eleanor laughed, the sound bright in the dusty old mill. "I spent my life eating delicacies I couldn't taste for all the diplomatic conversations happening around me. This will be the first breakfast I've truly wanted in years." They ate sitting cross-legged beside the fire, using wooden bowls Rowan had carved during their first evening in the mill. The porridge was simple but satisfying, sweetened with honey from Rowan's carefully packed provisions. "Where did you learn to cook?" Eleanor asked, savoring each bite with genuine appreciation. "My mother taught me," Rowan answered, his expression growing wistful. She believed a man should never depend entirely on others for his survival. "Learn to feed yourself, tend your wounds, and mend your clothes," she used to say, "and you'll never be truly helpless." "She sounds like a wise woman," Eleanor said softly. "I wish I could have met her." "She would have adored you," Rowan replied, reaching for Eleanor's hand. "Not because you're a princess, but because you have the courage to follow your heart, despite the cost." The day unfolded in a series of simple tasks that felt profoundly meaningful to Eleanor. She learned to build and tend the fire, to sweep the stone floor with a bundle of branches Rowan fashioned into a broom. In the afternoon, they ventured a short distance from the mill to collect water from the stream, taking care to remain hidden among the trees. As the sun began its descent, casting long shadows across their hiding place, Eleanor sat in the doorway, with the needle and thread, mending a tear in Rowan's spare shirt. The domestic tranquility of the moment struck her with its profound difference from the life she'd left behind. "Is this what ordinary people feel?" she asked suddenly, looking up from her stitching. "This sense of purpose in simple things?" Rowan, who had been whittling a piece of wood into what appeared to be a small flute, paused to consider her question. "I think people find meaning where they can, princess or peasant. The difference is in having the freedom to choose where to look for it." "You never call me princess when we're alone," Eleanor observed. "Because here you're simply Eleanor," he replied, his eyes meeting hers across the space between them. "The woman I love, not for her crown or her castle, but for her spirit, her courage, her heart." Eleanor felt tears sting her eyes, unexpected and overwhelming. "No one has ever truly seen me before you," she whispered. "Not my father, not the court, not even my late husband. They saw only the title, the strategic value, the vessel for continuing a bloodline." Rowan set aside his carving and moved to kneel before her, taking her hands in his. "I see you," he said simply, the three words carrying the weight of 1,000 promises. "I would see you if you were dressed in rags or royal robes, if you lived in a palace or a pauper's hut. Do you truly love me even if I lose the throne?" Eleanor asked, suddenly vulnerable in a way she'd never allowed herself to be before. Rowan's answer came without hesitation, his voice steady and certain. "I would love you even if there were no world at all. If we were the last two souls in existence, my heart would still find its way to yours." That night, as moonlight spilled through the cracks in the mill's ancient walls, they lay together on their makeshift bed, speaking of dreams they'd never dared voice before, of a small cottage somewhere by the sea, of simple lives filled with honest work and genuine connection, of children who would grow up valued for their hearts rather than their bloodlines. But their peaceful interlude was not to last. The following morning, as Rowan ventured to the edge of the nearby village for supplies, a weathered farmer recognized him from years before. "Aren't you the king's horse trainer?" the man asked, squinting suspiciously. "The one who served in the Northern Campaign." Rowan's blood ran cold, but he maintained his composure. "You mistake me for someone else, friend. I'm a traveling carpenter passing through." The farmer seemed unconvinced, but nodded slowly. "If you say so. Strange times we live in. A princess running off with a commoner, the castle in an uproar. They say the king hasn't sent soldiers after them. Peculiar, that." Rowan hurried back to the mill, his heart pounding. Eleanor met him at the door, her face paling as he recounted the encounter. "We've been recognized," she whispered, her hand flying to her throat. "We must leave at once." As they hastily gathered their meager belongings, a sound froze them both in place, the distant whinny of a horse, followed by the metallic clink of armor. Through a crack in the wooden wall, Eleanor caught the glint of sunlight on a soldier's helmet. The royal guard, she breathed, turning to Rowan with wide, fearful eyes. "They've found us." Rowan took her hands in his gaze steady despite the danger. "If your father has sent them to take us back, what do you think he will do?" Eleanor's fingers tightened around his. "I don't know anymore. The father I thought I knew would never forgive such defiance. But the letter I left him, I spoke truths. I've held silent for decades. Perhaps the question isn't what he would do to us," Rowan said softly, drawing her close. "The question is what he would do if he lost you forever." As the sounds of approaching horses grew louder, Eleanor and Rowan held each other in the fading light of the abandoned mill, their future as uncertain as the shifting shadows around them. The royal crypt of Avalmont lay deep beneath the castles. Stone foundations, a labyrinth of marble and memory where generations of monarchs slept their eternal sleep. Torchlight flickered against ancient walls as King Richard descended the worn steps alone, dismissing the guards who normally accompanied him on such visits. This journey was too personal, too raw for witnesses. The chamber he sought lay at the furthest end of the eastern passage, the final resting place of Queen Catherine, his beloved wife, taken too soon by a winter fever 12 years past. Her tomb stood in elegant simplicity, white marble carved with lilies, her likeness captured in peaceful repose upon the lid. Unlike the ostentatious monuments of previous rulers, Catherine had requested simplicity, a reflection of the woman she had been in life. Richard approached with reverence, laying a hand upon the cool stone. "I've failed her, Catherine," he whispered, his voice echoing softly in the sacred space. "I've failed our daughter." For a moment, he could almost feel his wife's presence. Her quiet strength, her gentle wisdom that had tempered his harsher instincts during their 26 years together. Catherine had been the only person who could challenge him without fear, who could make him reconsider a decision with just a raised eyebrow or a thoughtful question. "What would you have me do?" he asked the silence. "Our daughter has abandoned her duty, fled with a commoner. The alliance with Edlaw hangs by a thread. The court whispers of scandal and disgrace." He closed his eyes, remembering Catherine's voice. "And yet," he continued, "when I read Eleanor's letter, I hear your words in hers. Your courage, your conviction that love should guide us, not merely duty." With careful movements, the king knelt before the tomb and reached for the small, ornate chest that sat at its base, a repository for personal mementos of the queen that Richard visited on significant anniversaries. Today was not such an occasion, but he felt drawn to it nonetheless, as if Catherine herself were guiding his hands. Inside lay treasures more valuable to Richard than all the kingdom's gold. A lock of Catherine's auburn hair tied with blue ribbon, the pressed flowers from their wedding day, a miniature portrait showing her with infant Eleanor in her arms. But today, his fingers sought something else, a bundle of letters tied with faded silk that Catherine had written during the last year of her life, too weak to speak at length, but determined to leave her wisdom behind. Richard untied the bundle with trembling fingers and selected one particular letter, dated 3 months before her death, when she had rallied briefly, seeming to improve before the final decline. He unfolded the parchment, the familiar, elegant script, bringing a fresh wave of grief even after all these years. "My dearest Richard," he read aloud, his voice a reverent murmur in the stillness. "Today I watched from my window as Eleanor rode with the new stablemaster's son, the young man you hired after he saved those war horses. Rowan, I believe his name is. There is something in that boy's spirit that reminds me of you in your youth, before the crown weighed so heavily upon your brow. He has a heart that will never be tamed by convention or expectation." Richard paused, the words taking on new significance in light of recent events. I watched our daughter laugh, truly laugh, for the first time in months as he told her some tale or another. She is withering in this castle, my love. The duties we have placed upon her shoulders are crushing the joy from her spirit. I fear we have taught her too well that duty must always come before heart. The king's throat tightened as he continued reading. Remember how we were blessed, Richard? How our arranged marriage blossomed into true love? Not everyone is granted such fortune. If our daughter one day finds someone who makes her spirit soar, be he prince or pauper, do not stand in her way. Do not make her choose between her heart and her duty to you. Learn from the pain you have witnessed in so many loveless royal unions before it becomes hers. With all my love, Catherine. Richard pressed the letter to his chest, tears falling freely now in the privacy of the crypt. She saw it coming, he whispered. Even then she knew. A second letter caught his eye, one he had not read in years. He opened it with care, finding a passage that pierced him anew. Rowan has a heart that jamais sera domado, will never be tamed. If our daughter one day falls in love with someone of such spirit, do not stop her. Learn from the pain before it becomes your own. The king remained in the crypt for hours, reading through Catherine's letters, finding wisdom and foresight that he had overlooked in his grief. When finally he emerged, his face was lined with exhaustion, but set with new purpose. Meanwhile, at the abandoned mill, Eleanor's condition had worsened drastically. What had begun as a slight chill had developed into a raging fever that left her shivering beneath every blanket Rowan could find. Her forehead burned beneath his touch, her cheeks flushed with unnatural color. "Eleanor," he whispered, bathing her face with cool water from the stream. "Stay with me." Her eyes fluttered open, unfocused and bright with fever. "Rowan," she murmured, her voice cracked and weak. "Are they gone?" "The guards?" he replied, glancing toward the mill's entrance. "They searched the area but moved on before nightfall. We were well hidden." What he didn't tell her was how close they had come to discovery, how he had covered her mouth to stifle her coughing as armored boots passed mere feet from their hiding place in the mill's ancient grain cellar. Eleanor tried to sit up but fell, back with a groan. "Something isn't right," she whispered. "I've never felt this way before." Rowan's heart clenched with fear. He had seen this kind of fever before, during his time in the Northern Campaign, when soldiers had fallen ill with swamp fever after drinking tainted water. Many had not survived without proper medical attention. "You're going to be fine," he assured her, though dread coiled in his stomach. "You just need rest and fluids." Through the long night, Rowan never left Eleanor's side. He bathed her burning skin, helped her sip water, and whispered promises into her ear even when she was too delirious to understand them. "You will live," he repeated like a prayer, "and I will be here, even if the world hunts me to the end of time." By dawn, his own eyes were red-rimmed with exhaustion, his broad shoulders slumped with fatigue. But he refused to succumb to sleep, terrified that if he closed his eyes, she might slip away. "Don't leave me," Eleanor murmured during a moment of lucidity, her fingers weakly grasping his. "Never," Rowan vowed, pressing his lips to her knuckles. "Not even death could separate me from you now." As the morning light streamed through the cracks in the mill's walls, Eleanor's fever finally broke. Her eyes opened clear for the first time in hours to find Rowan slumped beside her, his head resting on the edge of their makeshift bed, his hand still firmly holding hers even in sleep. "Rowan," she whispered, reaching to touch his tousled hair. He woke instantly, disorientation giving way to relief as he saw the clarity in her eyes. "Eleanor," he breathed, his voice rough with emotion. "You're back." Without warning, tears spilled. and from his eyes, tears he had held back through the terror of the night, through the fear that he might lose her before their life together had truly begun. He gathered her carefully into his arms, burying his face in her hair. "I thought I might lose you," he confessed, his body trembling with the release of pent-up fear. Eleanor held him as tightly as her weakened state allowed. "It would take more than a fever to separate me from you," she assured him, though they both knew how close it had come. When Rowan finally composed himself, he kissed her with such tender reverence that Eleanor felt tears spring to her own eyes. In that kiss was every unspoken fear, every desperate prayer, every promise for the future. "We can't stay here," Rowan said when they parted, his expression grave. "You need proper care, proper food, and if the royal guard returns—" "Where will we go?" Eleanor asked, the reality of their situation returning like a cold wave. "We can't return to Avalmont. Not yet. Not until we know my father's intentions." Before Rowan could answer, a sound from outside the mill froze them both. The unmistakable approach of horses, not passing by this time, but stopping directly outside. "They've found us," Eleanor whispered, clutching Rowan's arm. But rather than the clank of armor, they heard a single pair of boots approach the door, followed by a familiar voice that sent shock coursing through them both. "By order of King Richard of Avalmont," called Lord Blackwell, the king's most trusted advisor, "I bring a message for Princess Eleanor and Master Rowan Mills." Rowan and Eleanor exchanged a look of mingled fear and confusion. What message could the king have sent? Forgiveness or condemnation? A chance for return or a sentence of exile? Their answer waited on the other side of the weathered mill door, carried by a man who had served the throne faithfully for decades. A message that would determine not only their fate, but the future of the entire kingdom. The central marketplace of Avalmont buzzed with the energy of hundreds of voices, each carrying fragments of the scandal that had rocked the kingdom to its core. Merchants abandoned their usual calls, advertising wares in favor of sharing the latest rumors. Fishwives clustered in tight circles, their weathered hands gesticulating emphatically as they debated the princess's flight. Noble ladies who normally wouldn't deign to mingle with commoners now leaned close to catch whispers from servants who claimed inside knowledge of the castle's turmoil. "They say the Duke of Edlaw has returned to his lands in a rage," a blacksmith told his wide-eyed audience, wiping sooty hands on his leather apron. "Swore he'd never again set foot in Avalmont as long as the king allows such an insult to stand." "Good riddance," muttered a young woman selling flowers, her cheeks flushing when heads turned her way. She lifted her chin defiantly. "What? We all know he's a cold man. My cousin served in his household for a season. Says he treats his dogs better than his servants." A few stalls away, a group of merchants discussed the political implications, with grave expressions. "The trade routes through Edlaw's lands are crucial for our wool exports," a portly cloth merchant lamented. "If the Duke seals the borders in retaliation, he wouldn't dare risk the king's wrath," interrupted another, though his tone carried little conviction. "The king's wrath?" scoffed an elderly wine seller. "Where is this wrath? 4 days since the princess fled, and not a single execution, not even a public flogging for the stablemaster's insolence. In my father's day, their heads would already be decorating the castle gates." The crowd's murmuring grew louder as a royal herald appeared at the edge of the marketplace, unrolling an official proclamation. People pressed forward, eager to hear the king's official position on the scandal that had consumed the kingdom. "By decree of His Majesty, King Richard of Avalmont," the herald began, his voice carrying across the suddenly hushed square, "all citizens are hereby informed that Princess Eleanor remains a royal daughter of the realm, regardless of her recent actions. Any person spreading malicious rumors or speaking ill of the princess will answer to the king's justice." Confused mutters rippled through the crowd. This was not the harsh condemnation many had expected. The herald continued, his voice unwavering. "Furthermore, His Majesty announces that the betrothal between Princess Eleanor and the Duke of Edlor has been dissolved by mutual agreement. The princess will be permitted to return to court without punishment when she so chooses. The marketplace erupted into a cacophony of astonished voices. Women clutched at each other's sleeves in disbelief. Men pounded tankards on tavern tables. Children, not understanding the significance but caught up in the excitement, darted between adults with gleeful shouts. In the midst of this chaos, an elderly woman climbed slowly onto a wooden crate that had held apples moments before. Her silver hair was bound in a simple knot, her dress worn but clean, the garb of a common woman who had seen many seasons come and go. "Silence," she called, her voice surprisingly strong for her frail appearance. "I would speak." The crowd's noise gradually subsided as people turned toward her, curiosity overcoming their excitement. "I have lived in Avalmont for 73 years, she began, her gnarled hands gripping a walking stick for balance. "I served in the castle as a young woman. I was there when our princess was born. I watched her grow into the woman she is today." She paused, surveying the sea of faces before her. "Many of you stand here judging her for following her heart, calling it a betrayal of duty. But I ask you this: what duty does a kingdom have to its rulers? Is it not to be governed with love rather than cold alliance? Is it not to be led by those who understand the heart of the common folk?" Murmurs of agreement began to ripple through the crowd, particularly among the women and younger citizens. "Princess Eleanor has shown more courage in one act than many show in a lifetime," the old woman continued, her voice gaining strength with each word. "She has reminded us all that beneath crowns and titles beat human hearts. And if our king now recognizes this truth, if he chooses to honor love over political advantage, then perhaps we are witnessing the dawn of a wiser reign." A young mother with a child on her hip stepped forward. "My husband fought in the Northern Campaign," she said, her voice trembling slightly with the effort of public speech. "He came back changed, speaking of horrors I couldn't imagine. The only horses that survived that bloody field were the ones Rowan Mills salvaged and nursed back to health, the same Rowan Mills who now loves our princess. A man who honors life isn't to be scorned, whatever his station." Others began to add their voices, tentatively at first, then with growing conviction. A tapestry maker recalled how Princess Eleanor had once stopped her royal procession to help an elderly man who had collapsed in the street. A blacksmith's apprentice described how she had established a fund for orphaned children after the river floods 3 summers past. Small acts of compassion and humanity that had gone unremarked at the time now took on new significance. By sunset, what had begun as scandal-mongering had transformed into something entirely unexpected, a groundswell of popular support for the princess who had dared to choose love over duty. Flowers began appearing at the base of her statue in the central square. Children left crude drawings depicting the princess and her horse trainer surrounded by hearts and flowers. Word of this remarkable shift in public sentiment quickly reached the castle, where King Richard received the reports with quiet satisfaction. The gambit he had set in motion with his proclamation was bearing unexpected fruit. "The people support her," Lord Blackwell reported, wonder evident in his usually stoic expression. "Not all, of course. The traditionalists among the nobility are outraged, but the common folk speak of her with admiration. They're calling it a love story for the ages." Richard nodded slowly, gazing out over the kingdom from his tower window. "And the message I sent with you, has it reached them?" "It has, Your Majesty. I delivered it personally, as instructed." "And their response?" Lord Blackwell hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "The princess was weakened by fever but recovering. Master Mills was protective, suspicious of our intentions at first. But when I assured them of your sincere wish for their return without punishment, I saw hope in their eyes." The king turned from the window, his expression unreadable. "And the conditions I set forth? I made them clear, sire. They have until the next full moon to decide. Meanwhile, miles away, Eleanor and Rowan sat side by side on a fallen log outside the mill, reading the king's letter for the third time. The parchment bore the royal seal and Richard's unmistakable handwriting, not the formal script he used for official decrees, but the more personal hand he reserved for family correspondence. "I still can't believe it," Eleanor whispered, tracing her father's signature with a fingertip. "After everything I did, the embarrassment I caused, he's offering us safe return." "With conditions," Rowan reminded her gently. Eleanor nodded. Rereading the key passage, "You may return to court with your chosen companion without fear of punishment or persecution. You will retain your title and privileges as princess of the realm. However, I ask only this, that you face me, your father, and your king, and explain to me in person why you chose this path. I deserve to hear the truth from your own lips, not from a letter left behind." "Do you think it's a trap?" Rowan asked, his protective instinct still wary after days of hiding. Eleanor considered this, studying the letter as if it might reveal hidden intentions. "No," she finally said. "This is my father's hand, his seal, and these words," she pointed, "to the final lines. I have spent days in your mother's crypt reading her letters. Perhaps it is time I finally listened to her wisdom, and to yours. Then we return." Rowan's question hung in the air between them. Eleanor took his hand, her fingers intertwining with his. "We return," she confirmed, "but we return on our terms. Not as a princess and a stable master sneaking back in disgrace, but as two people who chose love over convention and are not ashamed." The journey back to Avalmont took 2 days, with Eleanor's strength returning with each passing hour. They travelled openly now, no longer hiding from the royal guards who had been recalled to the castle. In each village they passed, they were met not with condemnation, but with curious glances and occasional smiles of encouragement. As they crested the final hill overlooking the castle, Eleanor reined in her horse, gazing down at the place that had been both home and prison for so many years. Rowan stopped beside her, reaching across to take her hand. "Are you ready?" he asked quietly. Eleanor drew a deep breath, squaring her shoulders as she had been taught from childhood, but this time the regal posture came not from duty, but from newfound strength. "I've never been more ready for anything in my life," she replied, and together they rode down toward the castle gates, where the next chapter of their extraordinary journey would begin. 5 years had transformed the gardens of Avalmont Castle. Where once formal hedges had stood in rigid patterns, wildflowers now danced among traditional roses, creating a harmonious blend of structure and freedom. The late afternoon sun cast golden light across this living tapestry as 2 figures walked hand in hand along a winding gravel path. Eleanor, now 43, moved with the same regal grace that had been instilled in her since childhood, but her face carried a serenity that had been absent in her earlier years. Her dark hair, threaded with occasional strands of silver, was styled simply, adorned with only a single pearl pin rather than an elaborate tiara. Beside her walked Rowan, his broad shoulders still strong at 45, his face weathered by sun and wind, but illuminated from within by contentment. "Papa! Mama!" A child's voice rang out across the garden, followed by the patter of small feet on the path. A boy of 4 years came racing toward them, his dark curls bouncing with each step, his father's warm eyes shining with excitement. "Thomas," Eleanor laughed, kneeling to catch her son in an embrace. "What treasure have you found today?" The boy proudly extended his hand, revealing a peculiar stone with veins of quartz running through its surface. "Grandfather says it's older than the castle," he announced with the solemn importance only a child can muster for such discoveries. "Did he now?" Rowan smiled, ruffling his son's hair. "And where is your grandfather?" Thomas pointed toward a stone. bench beneath an ancient oak tree where King Richard sat with a little girl of about 6 perched beside him. The king's hair had turned completely white, and he moved more slowly these days, but his eyes remained sharp as he showed his granddaughter how to feed crumbs to the garden birds. "Elizabeth is learning the names of all the birds," Thomas reported importantly. "But I wanted to find stones instead." "Two very different scholars," Eleanor observed with a warm smile. "Go on then, continue your expedition. We'll join you and grandfather shortly." As Thomas scampered away, Rowan slipped his arm around Eleanor's waist, drawing her close against his side. "Do you ever wonder," he asked softly, "what would have happened if you had gone through with the wedding to the Duke?" Eleanor leaned her head against his shoulder, contemplating the question. "Sometimes," she admitted, "in another life I would be Duchess of Edlor now, presiding over formal dinners and strategic alliances. Thomas and Elizabeth would never have been born, and I—" "And you?" Rowan prompted gently when she fell silent. "I would have honored my duty," she said finally. "I would have done what was expected, but I would never have known what it means to truly live." She turned to face him, cupping his cheek in her palm. "To truly love." Rowan turned his head slightly to press a kiss into her palm, a gesture that still sent warmth coursing through her after all these years, even when the entire kingdom was against us. "Especially then," Eleanor smiled, "though as it turned out the kingdom had more love in its heart than either of us suspected." They continued their walk toward the king and their daughter, passing the royal stables where Rowan still oversaw the training of the kingdom's finest horses. Though he now held the official title of royal equerry, he remained most at home among the animals, teaching young stable hands the gentle methods that had once been considered revolutionary. King Richard looked up as they approached, his weathered face breaking into a smile that transformed him from monarch to simply a doting grandfather. Little Elizabeth jumped up from the bench, her golden curls bouncing as she ran to her parents. "Mama, Papa, Grandfather has been telling me about how you ran away together," she announced, her eyes wide with the romance of it all. "Like in the storybooks." Eleanor exchanged an amused glance with her father. "Has he now? And what exactly did Grandfather tell you?" "That you were the bravest princess in all the land," Richard replied, his voice gruff with emotion. "That you taught an old king the most important lesson of his reign." The elderly king rose slowly from the bench, leaning on an ornately carved cane, a gift from Rowan on the occasion of his 70th birthday. Though he had officially passed the crown to his nephew, Prince William, 3 years earlier, Richard remained a respected advisor to the new king and a beloved figure throughout the realm. "Come, Elizabeth," he said, extending his hand to his granddaughter. "I believe Cook mentioned something about fresh honey cakes in the kitchen. Thomas might want to interrupt his geological studies for that." As the king led Elizabeth away, calling for Thomas to join them, Rowan and Eleanor found themselves alone beneath the ancient oak. From this vantage point, they could see across the castle grounds to the village beyond, where the afternoon market was in full swing. Banners bearing the new royal insignia, the traditional Avalmont lion, now paired with an image of a free-running horse, fluttered in the breeze. "I received a letter from Marston today," Rowan mentioned, referring to a young, stable hand who had left to establish a horse sanctuary in the southern provinces. "He says the methods we developed for rehabilitating war horses are spreading throughout the neighboring kingdoms. Even Edlor has adopted them." Eleanor smiled at this news. "The Duke may never have forgiven me personally, but at least some good has come from the connection between our realms." They walked in comfortable silence until they reached a secluded corner of the garden where a small glass pavilion stood. Inside, displayed on a pedestal of polished oak, rested a glass case containing a single piece of parchment. The letter Eleanor had left for her father on her wedding day, now preserved as a historical artifact. "The curator tells me it's the most visited exhibit in the castle museum," Eleanor said softly. "People come from all corners of the kingdom to read it." "The letter that changed a kingdom," Rowan mused, quoting the phrase that had become commonplace throughout Avalmont. "And our lives," Eleanor added, slipping her hand into his. That evening, as twilight painted the sky in shades of lavender and gold, the royal family gathered in the comfortable private chambers that had replaced the formal staterooms for family functions. Prince William and his wife joined them, along with various cousins and close friends who had supported Eleanor and Rowan through the years. After dinner, as was tradition on this particular date, the anniversary of Eleanor and Rowan's return to the castle, the king called for silence. "5 years ago," he began, his voice carrying the weight of memory, "I made the wisest decision of my reign. Not the most politically expedient, nor the most traditional, but the wisest." He raised his goblet toward Eleanor and Rowan. "I chose to listen to my daughter's heart rather than to centuries of custom, and in doing so discovered that a kingdom governed with love rather than mere alliance grows stronger, not weaker." He turned to where Thomas and Elizabeth sat with their cousins, the children's eyes bright with the excitement of being included in adult ceremonies. "You children are growing up in a different Avalmont than the one I knew as a boy," the king continued. "One where a person's worth is measured not by the accident of their birth, but by the quality of their character and the strength of their heart." Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes as her father raised his goblet higher. To Eleanor, "And Rowan," he proclaimed, "who taught an old king new wisdom." Later that night, with the children tucked into bed and the castle settling into peaceful slumber, Eleanor sat at her writing desk, penning entries in the journal she had kept since her return to Avalmont. Rowan entered quietly, moving behind her to place his hands gently on her shoulders. "What are you writing tonight, my love?" he asked, peering over her shoulder. Eleanor tilted her head back to look up at him, her eyes soft with contentment. "I'm writing about the day we returned. How terrified we were riding through those gates, not knowing what awaited us." "I remember," Rowan murmured, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. "I was prepared for dungeons, for exile, for anything but the welcome we received." Eleanor turned in her chair to face him fully. "Father told me later that he'd spent days reading Mother's letters in the crypt, that she had somehow foreseen all of this, had warned him not to make the same mistakes his father had made." Rowan knelt beside her chair, taking her hands in his. "Then I owe my happiness to a queen I never met." "We both do," Eleanor agreed, softly, "and to a king brave enough to change." She rose from her chair, drawing Rowan up with her. Together they moved to the window overlooking the moonlit kingdom, a realm transformed not by war or politics, but by a simple truth that had finally been acknowledged, that love, freely given and freely chosen, created stronger bonds than any treaty ever could. "The children asked for a bedtime story," Rowan said, slipping his arm around Eleanor's waist. "I told them I'd be back with one in a moment." Eleanor leaned against him, her head finding its familiar place on his shoulder. "What story shall we tell them tonight?" Rowan smiled, brushing a strand of hair from her face with tender fingers. "How about the one about a princess who fled on her wedding day with a horse trainer? And how the king's response shocked the entire kingdom?" Eleanor laughed softly, turning in his arms to face him. "That remains their favorite." "Mine, too," Rowan whispered, lowering his lips to hers in a kiss that, even after all these years, still felt like coming home. As our tale of Avalmont comes to a close, we're left to ponder the courage it takes to follow one's heart in a world built upon rigid tradition. Princess Eleanor chose love over duty, risking everything she had ever known for the chance at genuine happiness. Would you have found such courage? Would you have stepped away from the comfortable certainty of a life planned for you into the terrifying unknown of a life chosen by you? King Richard's journey reminds us that wisdom often comes not from clinging to the past, but from having the strength to embrace change. His willingness to examine his own beliefs, to value his daughter's happiness above political advantage, transformed not just one life, but an entire kingdom. Perhaps the true measure of love is not what we're willing to sacrifice for it, but what we're willing to become because of it. Eleanor and Rowan's story teaches us that sometimes the most royal thing one can do is to honor the truth within one's heart. If this tale of love and courage has touched your heart, we invite you to share it with someone who might need reminding that it's never too late to choose a different path. Follow our channel for more stories that challenge, inspire, and remind us of the power of love to transform even the most steadfast traditions. Like, share, and let us know in the comments, what tradition would you be brave enough to challenge? For love, until our next journey together, remember that the most profound revolutions often begin with a single courageous choice.